How are we doing today? Ready for an extended weekend? Is that where we're at? Yeah. I was talking to my graduate students this morning because it's really awkward when I don't talk to them in the mornings. But I was talking to my graduate students, and it was one of those mornings where the energy levels were really low. I don't have an explanation. I think it's a combination of the weather, the time of the year, the topics. It's just all the things going on. But I do have some information to share with you. I'm about 2 days late on sharing this. I shared it with my graduate students. I forgot to share it on Wednesday. KPMG heard Financial Times has announced that Deloitte is acquiring KPMG, which means we're ending the Big Four. Like, there's a reason why I was going to do it 2 days ago. It would have made a lot more sense. April Tuesday. Yeah. It's always one of those jokes that said, I saw this on Big Four Accountant, and I was like, all right, what's going on here? And then I said, oh. But yeah, a lot of my graduate students were they talking about they've got internships or actually not internships, job opportunities at Deloitte, KPMG, and some of them were like this, and that caught them off guard completely. And then some of them just started laughing, and they just knew exactly what I was up to. Anyway, yeah, I'm gonna have to really up my game for the future. I've got some April Fool's Day jokes in the bag that I really want. Well, there was one that I really wanted to do this year, but I just did not have the time because they insist that I work when I should be at work. So I'm gonna have to step on my game next year. Maybe some of you will be around to see that and say, Dr. Barnes, you promised a better April Fool's Day activity, and I say, yeah, I did. I'll let you know. Okay, today we're talking about Chapter 12, Human Resource Management Process. This is, so my pattern is that I try to cover chapters either in 1 or 2 days of lecture. So the longer chapters, I split into 2 days of content. The shorter ones, I do 1 day of content. This is not an entire day of content lecture. We're going to be out very early. So I think it's probably appropriate before I get started here to send some reminders about the rest of the semester. So first of all, our group over here has still to submit a presentation topic. So have you talked amongst yourselves and discussed? I mean, was this like an hours long conversation that you all had and you just couldn't come to a conclusion? Is that the way it was? Yeah. All right. So have a decision for me by end of day today, and somebody email me. And again, I don't want to cause drama or contentiousness amongst the group. I know that you probably all been taking it very seriously. But yeah, with respect to that, presentations at the end of the semester, we still need to settle on who's presenting on what dates. I've not got any preferences. The only request that I make is if there's absolutely a day that you cannot present on, let me know in advance, so that we don't schedule that. I was relating to a tale of how we had a presentation date set for several of the groups in one of my previous classes, and then one of the groups said, yeah, we can't actually do that date. We'll be gone. And I was like, why didn't you let me know this in advance? They're like, sorry. And so we had to make some alternate arrangements, but I'd like to avoid that if all possible. As far as more recent things to consider, we are exactly 1 week away from the Excel assignment being due. And many people have already completed and submitted that. If you've done that, kudos. You don't have to worry about that over the weekend. If you are in that boat that you still need to complete it, you still have plenty of time, but I would not wait much longer. Okay. At the very least, make sure you got your data downloaded. You start taking a look at it, get an idea of what you need to do. There's a lot of organizational tasks that you have to complete. A lot of work that you have to do to get everything organized. It is not one of those things you can complete in 30 minutes and be happy with. I guess technically you could complete it in 30 minutes, but your grade would reflect 30-minute completion. So let's not try to do this in 30 minutes. It's not a good idea. So 1 week from today, Excel assignments will be due, will need to be submitted. Again, not a difficult assignment, but it is one that you can lose points if you don't take it seriously enough. By the way, I just want to make sure that you are aware, I am very, very technically oriented on this particular assignment. The way you should think about this particular assignment is if you are doing something that you would submit to an audit partner and you are the associate. This is going to be your highest quality work. I want to make sure that you do everything that's talked about. Make sure you read the instructions in detail. If I tell you to do something in instructions, it will be counted off if you don't follow those instructions. So please make sure you're thorough on that. And then 2 weeks from today is our professional interactions are due. I think many people have actually submitted their professional interactions already. And again, that's one of those things that you've already done. They not have to worry about it. If you've not already done it, the first question is, have you completed your professional interaction experience, which means that you need to go to visit something, which I'm sure that many of you have the opportunity already. If you've not, there is one coming up very soon. I believe it's next Friday. I could be wrong about that. I want to say it's April 10th, but it's going to be over in the Innovation Lab. I don't know what the exact time is. It may take place at the same time as this course, which is a little bit awkward. But hopefully you've got to plan for your professional interaction experience. If you don't, you probably want to start working that out really, really quickly. But yeah, that's coming up. So please make sure you're aware of that. That's all I've got. So what do you say we talk about human resources management and then we skedaddle? Everybody good with that? All right. So this is a subset of something we've already talked about. I'd say that this very largely relates to the purchasing process and to some degree the revenue process. But this is why I was so insistent on making sure that when we went through the revenue and purchasing process, we had a strong understanding of that. And what we're going to start seeing for the rest of our process areas is that there's a lot of resonance with respect to those. This particular area is very simple and straightforward. I cannot emphasize how simple and straightforward it is. The scope of questions that I will ask on the exam is going to be a few multiple choice questions and then a partial problem at minimum, or sorry, at maximum. Right? So a few multiple choice questions and then a partial problem. The reason I say a partial problem is I may or may not include this in a problem. If I do, it'll be half the problem. If I don't, it won't be in the problems at all. All right. That's pretty much all there is to it. So what are we talking about? We talk about human resource. Well, we're talking about establishing sound policies for hiring, training, evaluating, counseling, promoting, compensating, and taking remedial actions for the employees, which you probably have taken entire courses over human resources and said, all right, there's a lot going on there. And I will agree. There is a lot going on with human resources, a lot of things that you do need to be aware of if you're operating human resources in an organization. But this is an auditing course. Specifically, it's very focused on financial statement auditing. So the one thing that we are very anchored on is what are the effects of human resources with respect to financial statement auditing? And the answer is payroll transactions. That's it. That's it. That's all there really is to it, is we have to audit the payroll transactions. So once an individual has been hired as an employee, the main transaction that affects the financial statement accounts is a payroll transaction. Now, payroll transactions are not so straightforward that we can just look at a single transaction and kind of say we're done. Or can we? I guess that's kind of the follow-up. So first of all, let's talk about the two different categories of transactions that are typically processed through human resource management. So the first one, pretty straightforward, one that you probably learned in 220 and still remember today, payments to employees for services rendered, right? That's all there is to it. Now, keep in mind, this can actually represent multiple aspects of the same transaction. When you think about the journal entry for that, usually the time this transaction is recorded is not the exact same time as when the transaction payment takes place. So you can actually aggregate payables and owed for a certain period of time, and then the transaction itself may be resolved at some point in the future, particularly if you're operating like on a weekly basis, but you aggregate information on a monthly basis. You've put together your financials on a monthly basis. There may be overlap between when the pay periods occur. So that's important to note. And then something related to this is going to be the accrual and payment of payroll-related liabilities arising from employee services. That includes liabilities for Social Security and unemployment taxes and other things in this category. Now, the good news is we're not going to get into the details of this. I'm assuming that you probably have already had plenty of experience with these details, talking about these in your other financial accounting courses and with respect to your tax courses, the other things that are included with respect to individual tax liability. But anything that's associated with payroll is basically kind of the second category. And those are all those things that if you look at a paycheck, all those deductions and all those items that are associated with that, those are included as well. The good news is that this is not an onerous inclusion, and we'll see why at the very end of this lecture. But I want to focus on this part right here for right now. We're going to focus on this, and then we're going to talk about this at the end. And trust me when I say it's actually pretty easy. It's actually pretty straightforward. So what are some areas that we need to understand with respect to transactions? Well, obviously, we need to know the payroll transaction itself, which is our first category, and the accrued payroll liability transactions. These are very heavily going to affect organizations' cash. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. When you make payments for payroll or for the payroll liabilities, those have to come out from somewhere. Usually it's going to be the cash accounts associated with that. There's also some ones that are pretty intuitive here. When we talk about direct and indirect and labor expense accounts, we talk about payroll and liability expense accounts, and these are accruals. But you notice they talk about inventory up here. Why is inventory in our payroll transactions? All right, what's going on here? Is this a typo? I'm just gonna say yes, and we'll just move on. It's a typo. No, so yeah, we're just gonna say it's no. When we think about everything that payroll could affect, keep in mind that we do have to consider even managerial and cost accounting. And this is one of those moments that Dr. Otero would walk in the room and she'd be so proud of me. She heard me speaking. She thinks that I don't take cost accounting very seriously. She's true. It's true. I don't take cost accounting very seriously, but it is important. Some important lessons to note here. When we talk about different categories of people within the organization, some of those individuals are going to be directly associated with the production of the organization. So we can actually capitalize cost as part of the inventory, and that includes employee services with respect to the production. So if they're directly associated with production, they've included a cost of inventory. Now, again, that's largely irrelevant to what we're going to be doing in this course, but it's important to remember because we have to know all sources or all transaction effects that are associated with payroll transactions. So that's going to be included in that. So the documents and records, for some of these are going to be less relevant than others. So personnel records are obviously really important, including the tax documents. We also are going to have our time card or timesheet. This is obviously relevant to people who are categorized on an hourly basis. Now, note this is more relevant for organizations for employees in the organizations who actually are paid on an hourly basis. So the reason why is that you can have people in an organization whose activity is tracked on an hourly basis. That's going to be true for a lot of you who go to work in public accounting. They're going to have to track your time and expenses, but that's mostly for customer tracking to actually know how much should we charge to a particular customer for the services rendered, not for the actual payment amounts. With our regards, we're talking about actual payments based on time. So we're going to talk hourly basis. So this is going to be less relevant for salaried employees. Then we have our check and the deposit records and all the payroll associated files associated with that, any reports, and then the tax documents that come from that. I would say largely our focus in this particular lecture is going to be on the time card and timesheet and the payroll check. Those are going to be our two most critical documents for this process. It's not saying you don't need to know the others because they all can represent types of source documents or generation documents. So those are the ones that we're going to tend to spend most of our time talking about. All right. What are the functional areas of the human resource process? This is where things get a little bit fancy. So remember we talked about the functional areas within the other process areas. We talked about revenue and purchasing. We're going to talk about all these as well in this process. The problem being is that payroll does not necessarily have a lot of standalone functional areas. They tend to overlap other process areas. So for example, operating departments. So is this a payroll function right here? No, these are operating departments within the organization. So why did I include them as a payroll function? This is the emanation of when human resources are generated. An operating department says, we need a new individual in this position. So Dr. Caden eventually gets so frustrated with me, she says, you're fired, Dr. Barnes, which if she did, no fault to her, I probably deserved it, okay? But she says, we need a new person who can teach AIS and auditing, and so they actually make a request for that. So that would be similar to what we talked about in the purchasing process when the operating departments request goods, except this time they're requesting a personnel, an individual who can do the job in that area. So that's the way we think about it, the request for new employees, similar to the request for goods or services. Then we have human resources that are hiring the new employees and authorizing the pay. That's a pretty straightforward one. We've got supervision of their activities, which again is more of a departmental activity because these are going to be people who are working in those departments. So if Truman State hired somebody to replace me, that person would then be within the business economics department. That would be somebody, and they'd have to have Dr. Caden supervising. She'd be saying things like, you are so much better than our previous auditing and AIS professor. And I said, well, it was not a high bar to cross. All right. So then we have timekeeping, processing employee activity, making sure that we actually see what the activity is and the basis for pay. Then we have payroll, recording the payroll transactions, because most people, they don't work for utility. They work because they actually have to make a living. It would be wonderful if I could be in that position. I could just teach auditing for fun. I would tell you all such different stories if I could get away with that, all right? If I could teach auditing for fun, that would be the goal. First of all, there'd be no exams, because then I'd get away with it. It's like they fired me. It's like, you weren't paying me anyway. So, yeah. But, yeah, that was the goal. I mean, encompassing a lot of my dreams here in this discussion. I'm not sure what's going on. It's like, I don't know that I really dream about getting fired from Truman, but I definitely dream of a day with no exams. All right. So, cash disbursements, that's how we actually disperse the payroll. And we know that this one's not unique to the payroll process because we talked about cash disbursements in the purchasing process area. And then our general ledger accounting, that's going to be kind of our any subsidiary ledgers that we would organize according to payroll, as well as the general ledger, all the accounting treatment there. It's a recording step. I'm going to include these on the next few with a three-way match. We might want to talk about what documents we would actually have to note for making sure we record payroll processes. This would probably be time card, paycheck, and then the actual record itself. And those aren't really three source documents. Two of them are source documents, and then we would actually have the record of the system itself. We want to make sure that the information going into the system is correct. So that's why there's a question mark there. It's because it's not a true three-way match simply because we're not dealing with three different source documents. All right. So you'll notice I've got a snazzy picture of a car up here, and it's not just to prove that I still remember how to spell it, okay? There will be a day that that's not, I'm no longer capable of that, but we're not here today. So what does CAR stand for? Custody Authorization Recording. Guess what we're going to do? We're going to talk about custody authorization recording here. Now, as we move forward, you note that I talked about this back in revenue and purchasing, and I said these are fairly distinct. Even if there's some overlap, there's a fairly good distinction for all of these. It becomes more and more challenging with the future as we move into the future. It's going to be much more difficult to identify process areas according to their functional responsibility. That being said, we're still going to try because I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to do so. So if we're talking about the operating departments, these are the ones that are requesting goods. And this is like the operating departments we talked about in the purchasing process. So what did we categorize those on Monday when we talked about this? Is this custody authorization or recording? Let me ask this a different way. Is this custody authorization or recording? Recording, yes, because we're requesting goods or requesting the individuals, much like we're requesting goods and services in the purchasing process. Then human resources. Let's read the description. Hire new employees and authorize pay. All right. So what do y'all think about this one? Authorization, yes, is where we authorize the hire and make sure we get the people that we need. All right. Now, supervision. What's another word for supervision? Authority. Okay, so if we talk about authority and we're making sure that these are people who are responsible for approval of employee activities, this is another authority step. Now, why do we have two authority steps here? The answer is this is an organizational authority step. This is more departmental levels of authority, making sure that they're doing the things that they should be doing within their departmental operations. All right, timekeeping. All right, we've got the trend now. We know what's going on here. Timekeeping is pretty straightforward. What is this responsibility area? This is recording, okay? We're putting those time cards together, make sure we record that activity. Then we've got payroll, which is another recording transaction. But again, this is a same separation we see over here. This is going to be occurring at the departmental level. This is going to be occurring at the organizational level. So we can have separate recording activities. Then we finally have cash disbursements, which we know cash is an asset. So this has to be custody. Yes, our only real custody function with respect to payroll is going to be cash disbursements. And then I already mentioned general ledger accounting is our ultimate recording function. That's where everything goes into the system. That's where we record the transactions related to timekeeping themselves. All right. Again, is there overlap here? Certainly. This is not a standalone item. This is not one of those absolutes that I'm going to give you. There definitely could be multiple responsibilities within our operating departments and within supervision. But for the most part, I think it's easier to think about the custody authorization recording responsibilities individually with respect to function. That will kind of keep things a little bit clearer with respect to how you think about these moving forward. All right, so we talked about inherent risk assessment. So what are some things the auditors should consider about the inherent risk of the human resource process? Believe it or not, there's a lot going on here, all right? So remember we talked about this back in revenue and purchasing. We said the industry is one of those things we have to consider. I would argue that industry is probably one of those considerations that we have to make, but let's go a little bit more granular. Let's talk about a little bit more detailed information. So what is a function of the industry? Could we say economic conditions might be a function of the industry? Yeah, and we could say that could be a broad context like minimum wage laws, or we could talk about the operations of a certain industry. This is kind of a fun story. Well, not really fun. It's an interesting story because I just realized I'm going to be talking about the pandemic, and there was nothing fun about that. All right, but so it's kind of interesting what happened as a result of the pandemic. So I was here in Kirksville, and during the pandemic, and teaching. whereas you all were off in middle school enjoying life, okay, or I guess high school enjoying life. And so actually, I got to imagine that was probably really frustrating to try to take classes online when it's a social experience. So maybe not enjoying life. But there was a real problem getting labor to go into certain positions here in Kirksville. So one of the biggest, hardest areas were the fast food restaurants here in Kirksville. And so Burger King, way down the way, they actually raised their wages to $15 an hour. And they were advertising this on the sign in front of Burger King. They said temporarily paying $15 an hour for people to work here because nobody wanted to work during the pandemic because of the risk associated with that. And so almost all of the restaurants did that same thing. Almost all the fast food restaurants raised their wages to $15 at least temporarily. There was one holdout. Does anybody want to guess it is? It's my favorite target for this entire course. Taco Bell. Guess what happened at Taco Bell? They basically lost all their employees, and they had like 5 people working there for the entire thing. And just if you go into Kirksville chat on the Facebook group, people were talking about they spent 2 hours in the drive-through line at Taco Bell. It was one of those things that I was both simultaneously shocked and entertained at the same time. It's amazing how that happens. That would be an example of an economic condition that would very, very heavily affect how people operate. And then whoever the owner was said, well, we're not going to pay people that much. And they kind of paid a penalty for that. But because they're Taco Bell, they recovered, and now they're still selling terrible food. Okay. So the supply of skilled workers, we're talking about high skilled areas. People will need specialized skills. That's going to be something that could affect hiring of individuals. The rate of employee turnover. We were just talking about fast food restaurants. That's something that's obviously a constant what they have to worry about. Actually, it's going to be in any kind of lower skill area. The rate of employee turnover tends to be high simply because people want to go for a good better deal. This is something that actually might be relevant in public accounting because we tend to see turnover as being high, especially at the lower levels, the associate levels. People go off and do work in industry, so that might be something we consider with payroll in that regard as well. Labor contracts. Organizations have labor contracts. I guess to some second degree, labor contracts negotiated through organized labor or through unions. Then there may be certain terms that they have to meet as far as payroll conditions and working conditions. This happens a lot in underappreciated areas where they do need that representation. Teaching is one of those ones that's really, really common and commonplace to have the labor contracts. And then finally, governmental regulation. If there are certain requirements or certain details we have to meet, that's going to affect the employee roles and employee labor and their payroll. This is one of my least favorite, by the way. I actually have a friend who works as a lawyer at Social Security Administration in a different state. And hearing some of the requirements that governments impose is just ridiculous. And you think I'm saying, oh, they're probably ridiculous. They're way too high. I'm saying, no, they're way too low. Okay. He actually told me about how many cases he can actually author in a given month, a given week. Something like he could effectively author 20 cases within a week if he needed to. Guess what their requirement is? 5 cases within a given week. All right. That's the last time I talked about it. And there's certain conditions that people can meet and they can't actually author those cases. And when I say authoring a case, it's basically doing a summary write-up of a judge trial. So you're basically transcribing something, which is not particularly difficult to do. You just have to provide information on what the rulings were and do some necessary research. So if you can do 20 in a week, like 4 a day, he has to do 1/4 of that. The incentive is not really to do 20 a week. There's the elevation in governmental jobs is not based on priority. It's based on the longevity. So the person who's been working there 20 years is going to get the promotion. The person who's been working there 5 years and been killing it, still not going to get the promotion for another 15 years. So governmental regulations are really, really wonky in some states. And this is one of those ones that we have to pay close attention to. I mostly just said that because I wanted to tell that story. And so, yeah, governmental inefficiency. Yeah, there we go. All right. Sorry to tell you that we're still not out of the Reliance strategy yet. We still got a little over a week before we get past the Reliance strategy, but it's coming and we'll cheer once we get to that point. Okay, we'll have a little bit of a celebration. Well, that makes sense because we're talking about payroll transactions for even a small organization. There's probably numerous of them over a period of time. It doesn't make sense for us to audit individual transactions. So we are going to plan to perform test controls over payroll transactions, and we're going to set document control risk for the human resource management process. Now, what is this usually accompanied by when I give you this slide? When I give you the slide, in the other ones, you notice there was also a picture here. It had the control COSO diagram as well, but I didn't include that here because we're past that now. All right. But what is this usually accompanied by? Me telling you about a table. And guess what? We have another table. This time it's only one. We only have one table because we only have one transaction area that's relevant. We'll talk about why that's the case in just a bit. So table 12-5 on 428 provides a summary of relevant assertions, which are transaction events, possible statements, control activities, and test controls. However, at this point, your focus should be understanding the association between all of these rather than trying to memorize the table. So what does this mean? Remember the control sequence diagram? I didn't put it in the slide because I didn't want you to get too attached to it. Okay, so I know it's an amazing image and everybody just loves it so much. But remember the control sequence diagram. We do have to understand what is our risks that are associated with given management assertions. How did our client implement controls with response to those risks? And then what do we need to do to test those controls? Exact same process here. We just need to understand how those relate to one another. And again, that's what my questions in this area are going to focus on. There will be a lot of them in this exam. There will be a lot of questions on that, which is why these tables are so important. So let's go ahead and talk about an example here. So my assertion is completeness. That's going to be the case. What is a possible risk or a possible misstatement in this area? Could we say that an employee performs the work, but it does not get recorded? Yeah, that would be a real problem for an organization. If an employee does their work, they worked 40 hours a week, and then that didn't get recorded, and they get a paycheck that's got 40 less hours of work on there. So, yeah, it's probably several $100s out of their pocket. I don't know. Most employees would not be like, oh, I didn't agree to record it. That's okay. That was a control failure. I understand these things happen. Employee would be kind of like, where is my money? Where is my money? So we have to make sure that there's strong protocols making sure that the items get recorded. So let's just go ahead and think about this. All right. Where does this source of information come from? Where would the source of information come from? Because remember, we're talking about completeness. So we're starting with the source documents and we're moving up to the record. Okay. So where's the source of this employee work? Assuming that we're talking about an hourly employee, what would be an easy source for this? Time cards, okay? So time cards, we want to make sure that if there's any missing time cards, we can identify them. So one way we could do that is we could go through, have a listing of all the people who work, and we could actually match names and see that all those individuals have time cards associated with them. That seems like a legitimate approach. Is there a simpler process, though, that we could actually use? And I'll give you a hint. It's something that we talked about on Wednesday, a characteristic of documentation that's very, very common and consistent. So we know that certain documents like purchase orders, like invoices, they have numbers associated with them, okay? And what's a characteristic of those numbers usually? They're numeric, Dr. Barnes. That's what it is. The characteristic of numbers is the numeric. Very good. Okay, but that was not the characteristic I was looking for. Okay. What's another characteristic? So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what do we call that? Sequence. They're sequential. Okay, sequential. Why is sequential numbering so important? If I go 1, 2, 3, 7, there's a gap there. I can identify that gap very easily because I know how numbers work. All right. I am especially good at numbers because I'm an accountant. All right. But if we can identify the numeric sequence, if we see a gap in the sequence, then we can say, what's missing here? Did something happen but did not take place? So that's going to be our control in this area. Use of sequentially numbered time cards or timesheets. Now, this is not the only control that we can actually identify, but this would be a good control for making sure that we don't have any issues with time cards that took place but not reported. So what might be an explanation? Somebody has their time card and they failed to turn it in, or the time card got lost. It's an electronic system. Something got messed up, and the time card did not get processed properly. Regardless of what the case may be, a sequential system of time cards would be a very easy control to make sure that everything gets recorded properly. All right. So that is the client's control. But what is our responsibility as auditors? We have to test the control. All right. So how would you test this particular control? Now let's do the easiest possible iteration of this. Now I know that you're probably thinking electronic time cards that would require looking in the system and going and looking at the source files. You're correct about that. But let's go ahead with the most easy to follow because this is complex stuff. So let's do it. Let's make it as simple as possible. Let's say that they use paper time cards because apparently they're operating back in the 1960s. All right. And they're using paper time cards and they're using sequentially numbered time cards. What are you going to do to verify that this control is in place? You've talked to the manager. You said, how do you control for making sure that employee's work is performed and it also gets reported, that you have complete employee processing? And he says, Well, we use sequentially numbered time cards. What is your next step? Say, well, good job. Good job. Thank you very much for telling me about this. I'm going to go to lunch. What is your next step? What would you do? What would you just intuitively do? There's no wrong answers here except for the correct one. Those are no, there's no wrong. That's it. No, except for the wrong ones. That's right. What am I saying? All right. So, what would you do here in this situation if you said, I need to determine if sequentially numbered time cards are there? That's true. Yeah, go and look at the sequentially numbered time cards. Okay, verify that they are there. So verify the numeric sequence time cards, timesheets. Now, that would just be a rote expression of documents. That's a pretty easy one. Could we expand this test fairly easily? Can we re-perform this and go and look at batches of time cards from previous iterations and say, all right, let me look at the time cards to make sure that they are verified numeric sequence, and if there were any exceptions, that they noted that in their documentation. That would be an easy follow-up. That would just be a re-performance. But this is a pretty easy intuition behind this is basically saying, if there's a sequential number of time cards, I want to look at these time cards. Now, the critical question, what do you guys think? Do these all support the completeness assertion? So completeness is a directional assertion, source documents to records. Do these all support that direction? Hopefully so, okay? I've been teaching I've been using this slide now for going on 10 years. And if it doesn't actually support the completeness assertion, I'm going to be really embarrassed. Sometimes things come up and I do make mistakes, but hopefully this is not one of them. All right, so if that's the case, then we can evaluate control risk pretty easily. Now, again, this is just one example. And we spent like 5 to 10 minutes just talking about this example. There's a whole table of these. So please make sure that you look at the tables to make sure that you have familiarity. We will review these concepts when we go into the exam itself, but it's really important to imposed upon you to make sure that you're familiar with the risks, the assertions, the controls, and the tester controls, because those are all the important parts of the exam. So let's talk about detection risk. So during this risk assessment, auditor established assess control risk. Then we have achieve control risk. What happens to detection risk if achieve control risk is the same or higher than this, or same as assess control risk. So basically, we determine what the actual level of control risk is based on our testing. It's going to be the same as our assess level of control. So there's no change. Does that change the detection risk? No, detection risk stays exactly the same. So let me change things now. We assess control risk, we test controls, we get our achieved control risk. So we believe that the actual control risk is higher than what we originally assessed. Do we need to change our detection risk in response to that? So think about this logically, okay? My control risk, I said it was here. We'll say this is moderate, all right? I test controls. My control risk goes up because the controls are actually worse than I thought they were. So my control risk goes up. What happens to my detection risk? Assuming that inherent risk stays the same. Probably goes down, okay? So we have lower detection risk. We like lower detection risk, don't we? I'm glad you all shook your heads. That was a trap, okay? We hate lower detection risk. So that means that we cannot tolerate nearly as much risk, and we have to do a lot more work. So basically, this is just a refresher concept to make sure you remember the concept of detection risk with respect to how control risk operates. Again, assuming that inherent risk stays the same. So that actually flavors what's going to happen with our substantive procedures. Because remember, if detection risk goes down, our substantive procedures expand. They go up. We have to do more work. We have to get more detail and more information. So let's talk about substantive procedures. First of all, substantive analytical procedures. For the most part, our substantive analytical procedures are going to involve kind of the same concepts we talked about with respect to revenue and purchasing. There's going to be a lot of ratio and trend analysis. They're looking at the big picture. We can actually do some reasonableness tests, but those are a little bit limited in scope. So you can kind of see here, we've got a lot of comparisons here, and these are looking at ratios or looking at actual numbers and seeing how they trend over time. So a lot of trend analysis to see if there's any outliers. Now, I just want to remind you with respect to analytic procedures in this regard, these are generally used to determine if we need to investigate a particular area further. So say, for example, I look at a payroll expense, and my payroll expense has been consistently 15% over 50% of sales over like a 5-year period. And then in the current year, it jumps up to 20%. Is that going to be something that I think is interesting as an auditor? Hopefully so. Hopefully. That was the point I was trying to allude to, that I'm going to say, I think this is something I should investigate further. So that's all that we're looking for in trend analysis. We're looking for anything that might be an outlier according to what the trends have shown us. Now, there's some other ones that we could actually look at. You will notice it says test reasonableness of account balances. This is actually where we could use a relationship between existing accounts to determine if the account balance makes sense. Do the reasonableness test. So an estimate of what the account balance should be, and then look at the actual amount, and then do that tolerable difference estimation. This is not largely used in payroll testing simply because it's very difficult to define relationships between accounts. We will talk a lot more about this when we start getting into our long-term assets, especially as they affect long-term assets, long-term liabilities, especially as those affect the income statement. So that will come up a little bit over a week. So we'll get into more detail on that. All right, let's do something different. What I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about some audit procedures associated with substantive testing. So we're going to talk about two categories of substantive testing. We're going to talk about transactions and events, then we're going to talk about account balances. Because remember, when we get to substantive procedures, we expand our assertions to both categories of assertions, both transactions and events and account balances. So we have to consider both of these. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at some examples of audit procedures. And what you're going to tell me is you're going to tell me which assertions these relate to. Now, we're going to do it today, and today is pretty easy. We're going to do it on Wednesday as well. I think Wednesday is easy. After that, things get a little bit more challenging, mostly because of my bad descriptions and my inability to type clearly. But hopefully you should still get something out of this. So this first one, I'm a little bit embarrassed because I still haven't made this adjustment. I probably should use the word categorization, but instead I said examine a sample of payroll checks for proper classification into expense accounts. So what's easier than a softball? Okay, what's easier than a softball? I gave you an easy one. What's the assertion here? Proper classification is a pretty big clue. Can we say classification? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Classification. All right. Compare a sample of timesheets to before and after period end to the appropriate payroll reports. Okay. So basically, we're looking at when the items were recorded in the period of time, make sure that these are going in the correct period of time. This is a pretty easy test. One we did for our homework really recently. What do we call that? Cutoff testing. Yes. Cutoff testing. Recompute a sample of payroll checks for gross pay deductions and net pay. So we look at the amounts. We calculate what we believe they should be. We compare them to what was recorded and see if those are the same. If they are, we've got insurance that, which management assertion? VAA, valuation allocation accuracy. Probably accuracy if we're talking about it very specifically, but for the most part, if you just say VAA, I'm always going to count that correct. So you don't have to delineate between the two, between the three. Trace a sample of timesheets to the payroll register. All right, here we go. Is tracing used correctly in this context? So timesheets to payroll register. Okay, so are we moving bottom to top? That's always the question you have to ask when you see tracing and vouching. Are we moving the correct direction? Because tracing is a bottom to top test. So if it is tracing and we agree that this is used correctly, this has to be which assertion? Completeness, yes, okay. Then vouching a sample of payroll checks to the master employee list to verify validity. There's that term validity again, but let's talk about this word vouch. Are we moving the correct direction here? Payroll checks are the end documents. They are kind of a source document to the end result, but they're generated a lot of times from the master employee list, particularly that hourly employee amount that people are paid, or if it's a salary, that actual salary paid that we can calculate a paycheck amount from. So we start with what's been recorded in the system and go down to another system item, but it's a much earlier system item recorded. Can we say that's still a bottom or top to bottom test? I hope so, because that's what I'm using here, and that's going to mean that it's which assertion? Distance occurrence. Yes, very good. All right, let's talk about account balances then. Search for unreported liabilities. All right, I know you're saying, Dr. Barnes, that is not payroll, that is purchasing. And you're absolutely right, it's purchasing, but it's also payroll. Is it possible that an organization could have what they owe their employees, and then we look at what the payments to employees are after that, and they pay an employee more than what they say they owe them? It's a possibility. It's a possibility that there could be an unreported amount owed to that employee that was not reported but was actually paid. So search for unreported liabilities could still apply if we're talking about the payroll process. So it's not a misnomer. It's just another application of the search for unreported liabilities. Unfortunately, for the search for unreported liabilities, there's no homework on this. Darn it. All right. So yeah, it's a gap in my curriculum. I'm working hard to fix it. All right. So search for unreported liabilities. Do we think that this actually meets the same assertion that we talked about in the purchasing process? Yeah. Which assertion was that? Completeness. Yes. Very good. Batch selected amounts from account schedules to accruals to supporting documents. So looking at the schedules that are in the system, and we're going down to the supporting documents such as the tax returns, benefit policies, such as that. So we're moving top to bottom, which has to be Not everybody at once. This is occurrence. Yes, this is occurrence. Okay. Obtain an account now schedule for payroll liabilities, foot schedules. What does that word foot mean again? We talked about that on Wednesday. Doing mathematical computations and a vertical analysis. Okay. What do we call it if it's horizontal? I am almost positive I talked with you guys about this. That actually may have been Monday, if not Wednesdays, because maybe it was because we actually were going to the spreadsheet. I said, look, there's a tick mark that says foot. What does foot mean? And you said, like that. But no, that wasn't it. Okay. That was where we did the mathematical actually in a vertical column. What do we call it in a horizontal column? Cross-footing. It's cross-footing. Okay. So putting schedules for accrued payroll liabilities and comparing amounts accrued to supporting documentation such as payroll tax returns. A lot of math going on, a lot of computations. That means it's probably what? BAA. Review supporting documentation to determine the entity is legally obligated to pay the liability. It's another one of those ones that if you read the words, it's pretty obvious because reading the phrase actually explains the assertion. So if they're legally obligated to pay the entity, then they probably are testing rights and obligations. Very good. You guys got on that really quickly. All right. So last thing I want to talk about. Information previous slides focused on payroll. So we just talked about payroll. So we've got a whole lot to talk about with respect to payroll related liabilities or not, because our process for testing payroll liabilities is basically the same. So I want you to take everything that we just talked about, apply that to payroll related liabilities, and then we can actually apply it to two processes simultaneously instead of one. It's easier to conceptualize from a payroll perspective, but the payroll liabilities regarding that are going to follow the exact same protocols, exact same control testing procedures, exact same concepts. So that's why this is such a short concept chapter, because I basically would be repeating myself if I tried to do two sections simultaneously. So instead, what I'm going to say is I'm going to say, use those concepts, apply those concepts, and then we're done for the day. Have a good weekend.